It started with a single sentence, one that stopped late-night television dead in its tracks. "I have to tell you something about Meghan." The audience laughed at first, thinking it was just another harmless celebrity anecdote, a light-hearted story shared between friends. But within seconds, that laughter faded into stunned silence. Because Jonathan Bailey wasn't joking. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Now, imagine this. You're sitting on your couch, scrolling through channels, and suddenly you see the man recently crowned the sexiest man alive. Jonathan Bailey, charming, disarming, always in control, looking dead serious as Jimmy Fallon fidgets nervously beside him. You can feel the tension through the screen. Something unscripted is happening. Something raw. And then that name. Meghan Markle. Not in a joke. Not in a throwaway reference. But in a way that makes every head in the room turn. As though he's just cracked open a secret the world was never meant to hear. Now, before you jump to conclusions, ask yourself this. Why would Jonathan, of all people, say something like that? Why now? Why, at the height of his career, risk it all for a revelation that could blow open years of royal image management, Hollywood PR, and delicate reputations? Was it a slip, a setup, or a confession? Because, as you're about to discover, nothing about this moment was random. This story isn't just about an actor and a duchess. It's about timing, silence, and the dangerous intersection of truth and fame. Let's rewind, but not to the beginning. Not yet. We need to start where the world first noticed something was off. The Tonight Show taping. Jimmy Fallon's show is known for its light banter, silly games, and celebrity charm. But on this particular night, there was something different. A subtle nervousness in Fallon's voice. A hesitation in Jonathan's smile. Even the studio audience sensed it. Some say the producers already knew. Others claim they tried to stop him backstage. One assistant later leaked that the mood shifted moments before Jonathan walked out, that someone on the team whispered, "If he goes there, cut to break." But they didn't cut in time. And when he said her name, everything changed. For context, Jonathan Bailey had just been announced as People's sexiest man alive. It was supposed to be his victory lap, his charming, witty, polished PR week where he'd dazzle America, laugh about his roles in Bridgerton and Wicked, and maybe reveal a few fun behind-the-scenes stories. Instead, he gave the world a confession. But what was it really? A moment of vulnerability? A misunderstood metaphor? Or an unspoken truth that had been haunting him for years? Theories spread like wildfire. Social media exploded. Clips of Fallon's shifting expression, from laughter to disbelief, racked up millions of views overnight. Hashtags trended globally. Memes were born before the segment even finished airing. Yet behind the noise, one question echoed louder than the rest. Did Jonathan Bailey just admit he'd been intimate with Meghan Markle? Of course, tabloids twisted the story instantly. Some claimed it was taken out of context. Others alleged the confession was more emotional than physical, a symbolic moment from years before fame. But the phrasing, the tone, the tremor in his voice, it was impossible to ignore. And Meghan? Total silence. No statement. No denial. No post. Nothing from her camp at all. Which, for anyone who's followed her career, is strange. Meghan is known for controlling her narrative. From the Oprah interview to the Netflix series, she's never been one to let other people tell her story. So why now, at a moment of apparent crisis, say nothing? Unless silence itself was the story. Unless that silence meant more than any words could. Now, to truly understand how we got here, we have to dig into the parts of their lives that don't make headlines. The early connections, the overlaps and circles, the quiet coincidences that only look innocent until you start connecting the dots. Because Jonathan and Meghan's paths crossed long before the cameras started rolling. In theater circles, at charity events, in the world of London's creative elite, a world where actors, royals, and rising stars often mingle out of the public eye. The kind of places where boundaries blur and stories are rewritten before they ever reach the public. And those who were there? Some say they saw sparks. Not scandalous, not overt, but enough to leave an impression. Enough that, years later, when Jonathan's name came up again in the most unexpected setting imaginable, people started whispering. Maybe there was more to it. But what does intimacy mean, really? Was it physical closeness? Emotional vulnerability? A shared secret? When Jonathan spoke, his choice of words was careful, but not careful enough. Fallon tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground, but Jonathan leaned in. He didn't smile. He didn't backpedal. He just said, almost under his breath, "It wasn't supposed to mean that much." That word hung in the air like a thunderclap. You could see Fallon freeze. The audience fell silent. Someone in the front row gasped. Whatever it wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't a bit. And then, almost as quickly, the cameras cut to commercial. The rest of that segment never aired. NBC released a shortened version on their YouTube channel the next morning, carefully edited. But fans noticed the jump, the missing 45 seconds of footage that turned the internet into an investigative crime scene. Frame-by-frame analysis, lip-reading, speculation, conspiracy threads, all trying to uncover what really happened in that uncut moment. But we'll get to that. Because to understand why that 45 seconds vanished, we have to go deeper into Jonathan's life before all this, and Meghan's before the palace. Into the choices they made, and the ones they couldn't take back. Let's be honest, Jonathan Bailey has never been one to chase scandal. He's private, measured, and deeply respected in the industry. So if someone like him decided to risk his reputation on a confession that explosive, there's a reason. Maybe guilt. Maybe longing. Maybe an attempt to reclaim something that fame had taken away. You see, the British acting world is small, smaller than most people realize. Everyone knows everyone. And in that world, years before Meghan became a Duchess, she wasn't just the American actress from Suits. She was a regular on the London social circuit, often invited to premieres, charity galas, and after-parties. There, she met countless British stars, actors, producers, writers. Some connections faded instantly. Others lingered quietly in the background. And according to whispers that resurfaced after Jonathan's bombshell, one of those lingering connections was him. It's here, in this gray area between rumor and truth, where our story takes shape. Now, pause for a second. Why do we even care about this? Why do millions of people dissect every royal whisper, every celebrity confession? Because, deep down, these stories are mirrors. We see our own contradictions, ambition versus privacy, truth versus reputation, desire versus duty. And Jonathan's moment on The Tonight Show wasn't just a confession. It was a crack in the polished glass of celebrity illusion. A moment when a man who's built an entire career on poise and precision suddenly let the mask slip, and for a few seconds, revealed something that didn't fit the script. That's why it mattered. Because it felt real. It didn't feel like PR. It didn't feel rehearsed. It felt like a man haunted by something that wouldn't stay buried. And now, that secret is out, whether he meant it to be or not. So what happens next? When you're crowned sexiest man alive, you're expected to play the role. Charming, scandal-free, endlessly likable. But after this, Jonathan's world began to shift. His team went into damage control. Fallon's staff went silent. And Meghan's name suddenly became unsearchable on certain platforms connected to NBC's uploads, as if someone wanted to erase the link altogether. But erasing a story like this is impossible, because once it's out, it lives forever in the digital bloodstream. And that's where we find ourselves, caught between speculation and truth, watching as two lives collide again in ways no one anticipated. So here's what we're going to do. Over the next chapters, we'll piece together what really happened, not just that night on The Tonight Show, but in the years leading up to it. We'll follow the breadcrumbs through private parties, public appearances, hidden friendships, and the untold moments where fame met fate. And by the end, you'll understand exactly why Jonathan Bailey said what he said, and why Meghan Markle never said a word in return. But before we uncover the first clue, before we open the vault on their past, you need to see what happened in the seconds after the cameras cut to black. Because what Jonathan did next wasn't part of any plan. It was supposed to be just another evening on late-night television. Bright lights, a polished host, a celebrity guest, laughter, banter, applause. But for Jonathan, tonight felt different. Something in the air made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Something felt electric. He'd rehearsed his jokes, his stories, even his smile. Everything was scripted, safe, perfectly curated. And yet, the moment he stepped onto that stage, something shifted. Maybe it was the energy of the crowd. Maybe it was the quiet tension radiating from Jimmy Fallon. Or maybe it was the story he'd been holding inside for years, a story he'd never planned to tell on live TV. From the very first handshake, Fallon sensed it. There was a hesitation, a pause that didn't belong. The cameras rolled, the audience clapped, but the air between them was charged. Fallon tried to start with the usual small talk. "Congratulations on all your recent awards, Jonathan," he said, voice bright, too bright. Jonathan smiled, too wide, too knowingly. "Thanks, Jimmy. It's been quite a year." The pause stretched. Fallon sensed the shift, but kept going. "And now you're known as one of the most talked about men in the world." Jonathan leaned forward slightly. There was a glint in his eye, the kind of glint that comes before someone says something unpredictable. "Yeah," he said, quiet, measured. "They say that. But sometimes the stories people talk about aren't the ones you expect." The audience laughed nervously. Some cheered, but a few leaned forward, sensing tension where they shouldn't have. And then came the first subtle tease, the first thread of curiosity that would unravel the night. Jonathan mentioned a figure everyone knew, a cultural icon, a symbol of fame and controversy, someone whose life had been dissected by tabloids and social media. Nothing concrete, just a name, a spark. It hung in the air like a dropped match. The audience chuckled at first, unsure if it was a joke, but Fallon's smile faltered. Wait, he said. "You're serious?" Jonathan didn't answer immediately. He let the moment stretch. The camera cut to a close-up of his hands, calm, resting lightly on the table, but his eyes betrayed him. They were alive, alert, almost mischievous. "What do you mean by that?" Fallon asked, carefully, trying to regain control. Jonathan leaned back. "I mean," he said, and paused again. "Sometimes the most talked-about stories aren't really about the person everyone thinks they're about. Sometimes it's about perception." A nervous chuckle rippled through the audience. The laughter was uneven. Some were nervous, others intrigued. And right then, in that moment, something clicked. Jonathan had taken the stage not to entertain, but to unsettle. He began recounting a story, not intimate, not scandalous, but strange enough to make everyone listen. A story from years ago, in the dim glow of an after-party where actors, creatives, and rising stars mingled. Everyone was laughing, glasses in hand, when a single glance between two people changed the night. A small gesture, a fleeting connection. It seemed insignificant at the time, but years later, it became the pivot for a narrative no one could ignore. Fallon, sensing he was out of his depth, tried to steer things back to safer territory. "That's interesting," he said, voice pitched higher. "But let's talk about Bridgerton. Your fans are dying to hear about season 3. Jonathan smiled. "Oh, we will get there," he said. "But first, there's something people forget about fame, about being in the spotlight. It's that every story has layers. Every public moment hides 1,000 private ones." A pause. The audience leaned in. A few viewers, already following social media threads, started tweeting, "Something's happening." Jonathan didn't stop. Sometimes the moments that feel personal are the ones everyone wants to know about. And sometimes, the stories people tell about you aren't even true. But that doesn't stop them from spreading. Fallon blinked. A bead of sweat glimmered on his forehead. "I think we're getting a little deep here," he said, forcing a laugh. But the audience wasn't laughing. They were mesmerized. Because Jonathan had done something rare. He had brought uncertainty into a space designed to be predictable. And then came the line that would define the night. Not a scandal, not a confession in the literal sense, but a statement so unusual, so unexpected, it made every viewer pause mid-breath. "Some connections," he said, leaning forward again, eyes sparkling in the studio lights. "Leave marks that stay with you forever, no matter how famous you get, or how many people are watching." The audience laughed nervously, unsure if he was joking. Fallon chuckled, shuffling papers, trying to regain control. But in the back of his mind, he knew this was no ordinary story. The words lingered. They felt like a puzzle, a hint, a tease that demanded attention. And in that moment, something shifted in the room. A subtle electricity. The kind you can't plan. The kind you can't fake. The cameras cut to commercial, but the spell wasn't broken. Clips leaked online immediately. Within hours, hashtags were trending. Fans speculated endlessly. What did Jonathan mean? Which connection? Who? Why now? And here's the key. No one could stop talking about it, because the story was real in its emotional resonance, even if the facts were deliberately vague. Jonathan had done something clever. He had revealed enough to captivate, but not enough to satisfy. He'd created a curiosity loop, the perfect storm of intrigue, ambiguity, and narrative suspense. By the time the next commercial ended, the studio audience was buzzing. People leaned forward, whispering to neighbors. The energy was palpable. Even Fallon, seasoned and sharp, seemed momentarily unmoored. He knew this night would be remembered, not for jokes or games or celebrity trivia, but for the moment Jonathan Bailey blurred the line between private and public in a way no one anticipated. And outside the studio, social media was ablaze. Every clip uploaded, every comment made, every meme created fueled the fire. Fans dissected every syllable. Experts debated tone, implication, and meaning. It wasn't about what had happened. It was about the potential of what could have happened. Jonathan's publicists were scrambling. They weren't worried about defamation or scandal. They were worried about expectation. Because now, everyone wanted a story. And Jonathan had shown that he could deliver tension, drama, and curiosity with nothing more than his presence, his timing, and a few carefully chosen words. By the end of the night, one thing was clear. Nothing about Jonathan Bailey would ever feel ordinary again. He had turned a light-hearted interview into a global mystery. He had captivated millions. And he had left everyone asking the same question. What really happened that night? Behind every public persona lies a private story. Every smile, every perfectly timed laugh, every charming wink is carefully calibrated. And for Jonathan, nothing was more deliberate than the way he moved through the world. To the audience, he was the sexiest man alive. To his fans, he was charming, witty, and untouchable. To the media, he was a golden ticket, the kind of actor who could sell headlines without ever stepping out of character. But behind the polished exterior, Jonathan had spent years building walls. Emotional walls, professional walls, walls so subtle no one could ever accuse him of arrogance or inaccessibility. The Tonight Show reveal, ambiguous as it was, exposed a crack in that armor. A glimpse of something more complicated. A man who wasn't just a celebrity, but a human being navigating fame, expectation, and memory. Jonathan's rise wasn't instantaneous. He had started in theater, performing in small London stages where the audience was intimate, discerning, and brutally honest. Every role he played demanded precision. Every performance demanded that he pour himself into a character, yet remained distant enough to walk off the stage unscathed. He became a master of duality, fully immersed in a character while maintaining control of his own emotions. Those who worked with him noticed it immediately. He could deliver heart-wrenching monologues one minute and then retreat behind a wall of humor the next. To colleagues, he seemed enigmatic, always present, yet never fully revealed. And that skill carried into his life offstage. Jonathan learned early that the world of fame was unpredictable, even unforgiving. Every interaction could be dissected, misinterpreted, or weaponized. A comment, a glance, a gesture, they could be turned into stories by people who didn't know him at all. He became meticulous, deliberate, and, at times, distant. His friends often described him as magnetic yet unreadable, a man who could command a room without dominating it, who could charm effortlessly but never overexpose himself. In interviews, he was always carefully measured. He laughed at jokes, he answered questions, but he rarely gave away the essence of who he really was. Except for that night. On stage, when the cameras rolled, Jonathan allowed just enough of his real self to surface. A flicker of mischief, a trace of memory, a shadow of emotion. Not enough to reveal everything. That would be reckless, but enough to ignite speculation. Enough to make audiences lean forward, curious, compelled, questioning everything they thought they knew about him. And yet, despite the drama on television, Jonathan's life outside the lights was not so different. He remained intensely private. He avoided the tabloids, maintained a small circle of trusted friends, and had a ritual for protecting his inner life. Every decision, every choice, every public statement was filtered through that lens. How much do I reveal? How much do I protect? How much will history misinterpret? It wasn't just about fame. It was about survival. In an industry where perception often outweighs reality, Jonathan had learned that appearances could be weaponized. A careless word could derail a career, a misinterpreted smile could fuel a rumor, and a misunderstood action could haunt him for years. So why did he take the risk on Fallon's stage? Why allow even a hint of ambiguity to leak? The answer, perhaps, lies in his humanity. Behind the mask he wore for the public was a man who valued honesty, not the kind broadcast in press releases, but the kind that felt true, even when messy or inconvenient. He understood that stories have power, that truth, carefully revealed, could be transformative, that sometimes the only way to reclaim a narrative was to step into the spotlight unguarded, even if just for a moment. Friends close to Jonathan describe him as contemplative. He spends hours reflecting on interactions, on choices, on moments that left a mark. He is fiercely loyal, deeply introspective, and at times painfully aware of the consequences of his own charisma. He knows the weight his presence carries, the influence of his words, and the scrutiny of the world watching every move. Yet, for all his caution, there is an undeniable spark of rebellion, a willingness to defy expectation, to disrupt the narrative carefully written for him by others. That night, on Fallon's stage, that spark surfaced. It wasn't reckless. It was intentional, a subtle acknowledgement that, even within the confines of celebrity, he could still assert agency over his own story. And make no mistake, it was a risk. Social media had already begun dissecting every gesture, every glance, every syllable. Analysts and fans debated endlessly, replaying clips and debating hidden meaning. His publicists were likely drafting statements before the commercial break ended, calculating the damage and planning the strategy. Yet Jonathan remained poised, almost serene, as if fully aware of the storm he had created and fully capable of weathering it. This duality, the tension between public perception and private reality, defines him. It shapes the way he approaches life, relationships, and career, and it becomes even more compelling when we consider the circles he moves in. London theater, Hollywood productions, high-profile social events. Each arena demands a different persona, yet all require control. Jonathan has mastered this balancing act, walking the line between access and distance, exposure and protection, curiosity and discretion. And it is precisely this mastery that makes the next part of the story so fascinating. Because when a man like Jonathan allows even a hint of vulnerability to surface, a flicker of memory, a suggestion of connection, a glimpse behind the curtain, the effect is immediate, profound, and far-reaching. The audience senses it. The media senses it. And in our fictionalized narrative, the ripple extends even further. Everyone who witnesses the moment begins to speculate, wonder, and theorize. They create stories, as humans do, trying to fill the gaps left by intentional ambiguity. Jonathan Bailey, the man behind the mask, understands this. And he also understands the danger. In a world obsessed with narrative, ambiguity is both a weapon and a risk. One misinterpreted moment can dominate headlines for weeks. A single phrase can define or ruin a reputation. Yet, paradoxically, it is the very ambiguity that makes him compelling, that fuels the stories, that ensures that when he speaks, people listen. And here, as the chapter closes, we return to the Tonight Show moment. The flicker, the spark, the subtle reveal, it wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. It was the carefully measured breach in the armor that makes this story worth telling. The public may not know all the details. The media may speculate endlessly. But one thing is clear. Jonathan Bailey is no ordinary celebrity. He is a strategist, an actor, a human being, and above all, a man who understands the delicate art of revealing just enough and keeping the rest hidden. But what happens when the ripple spreads beyond the stage? When fans, media, and fictionalized narratives collide in a storm of speculation, analysis, and curiosity? That's where our next chapter begins. And it's where the story truly deepens, revealing the complex world behind the celebrity facade. Because even the most controlled persona can't contain the chaos of curiosity forever. And in Jonathan's world, every revelation, even one hinted at with subtlety, comes with consequences. Every story has a beginning. Even a story wrapped in fame, lights, and late-night drama begins somewhere quiet, unassuming, and often overlooked. For Jonathan, It started in the less glamorous corners of London's theatre scene, a world of small stages, relentless rehearsals, and audiences that were brutally honest. Before the title of Sexiest Man Alive, before the magazine covers, before millions of eyes tuned in to his every gesture on late-night TV, Jonathan was just another actor trying to make a mark. And yet, even then, there were signs that he would become something more than ordinary. His early years were shaped by discipline and observation. He absorbed everything: the way actors controlled space, how directors manipulated emotion, how audiences reacted to even the subtlest gesture. He learned to move between roles, to become different people at different times, while quietly maintaining a core of himself that only a few trusted friends ever glimpsed. At that stage in life, anonymity was a blessing. It allowed him to experiment, to fail, to grow without the pressure of public scrutiny. He learned that talent alone was rarely enough. Timing, perception, and strategy mattered just as much. One misstep, one misjudged performance, could send a career spiraling. And yet, Jonathan thrived. Not because he was the most flamboyant, not because he craved attention, but because he understood people. He understood narrative. Not just the stories on stage, but the stories audiences wanted to see, the stories that would stick in their memory long after the curtains fell. It was in these formative years that he began to develop what would later become his signature skill: the ability to charm and disarm simultaneously. He could be witty without arrogance, confident without brashness, and enigmatic without alienation. Those who worked closely with him noticed a pattern. Jonathan didn't just act. He calculated, observed, and adapted. He played the long game. The world of pre-fame Jonathan was also one of contrasts. On stage, he was fearless, commanding attention effortlessly. Offstage, he was cautious, introspective, and fiercely protective of his private life. He maintained a small circle of friends, people he trusted implicitly. He avoided the gossip that flowed through the theater world like a hidden current. He learned to listen more than he spoke and to measure his words carefully. It was also during this period that he began encountering the figures who would later populate his public narrative: friends, colleagues, and acquaintances who operated at the intersection of creativity and influence. He met directors who demanded perfection, fellow actors who pushed boundaries, and producers who could make or break a career with a single call. He learned to navigate all of it, quietly, deliberately, always aware of the stakes. Among these encounters were fleeting relationships. Alliances formed and dissolved as quickly as they appeared. Some were professional, some personal. Many left impressions, moments that would later resurface in unexpected ways. He learned that every connection carried weight, and even the smallest interaction could ripple across years. One story from this period, often recounted by theater insiders, illustrates this perfectly. Jonathan was performing in a late-night play, a tiny production in a cramped studio theater. A well-known actor in attendance approached him afterward, complimenting his performance. Jonathan thanked him politely, but instead of reveling in praise, he asked a single question: "What would you have done differently?" The question shocked the other actor. Most people would have accepted the compliment, basked in it, maybe even used it for self-promotion. Jonathan wasn't most people. He was already thinking in layers, about growth, about perception, about the narrative of his career. It was this mindset, cultivated long before any recognition, that allowed Jonathan to navigate the chaotic world of fame later in life. He understood that public image was malleable, that the stories told about you often mattered more than your actual achievements. And he learned to control those stories, subtly, deliberately, often before anyone else realized they existed. But even in this calculated world, there were moments of unpredictability. Moments where the carefully constructed mask slipped. Moments where laughter, friendship, and human curiosity intersected in ways that could leave a lasting impression. And it was in these fleeting, unscripted moments that the seeds of Jonathan's later public persona were planted. Because what makes a star isn't just talent or appearance. It's the ability to turn vulnerability, curiosity, and unpredictability into magnetism. Jonathan had discovered this early, even in the dimly lit theaters of London. He had learned to hold just enough back to remain mysterious, while letting enough slip to be captivating. This balance, between exposure and concealment, became his signature. It allowed him to navigate complex social and professional landscapes with grace. And it's what made his later appearances on global stages, interviews, and talk shows so electric. Because when someone who has mastered control allows even a hint of unpredictability, audiences notice. In these pre-fame years, Jonathan also learned another lesson. Timing is everything. A joke told too early, a story revealed too soon, a gesture misread, all could have consequences. He understood that patience often yielded more than impulsiveness. A story held, a moment delayed, could have far more impact than immediate disclosure. This is precisely why the Tonight Show moment resonated so strongly. The audience may have perceived spontaneity, but it was layered, deliberate. The man who seemed to let a secret slip was, in truth, wielding years of experience in timing, narrative, and perception. Every pause, every glance, every carefully chosen word reflected the skills honed during his pre-fame years. And yet, even with all this preparation, there were elements he could not control. The unpredictability of audience reaction, the speed of social media, the whispers that spread faster than any carefully scripted statement. These forces were beyond anyone's grasp. They were wild, chaotic, and potentially career-defining. Jonathan had learned to navigate chaos, but not to predict it fully. He had learned to play with perception, but he knew the limits. And he understood that some moments, once unleashed into the public sphere, could never be contained. As this chapter draws to a close, it's clear that Jonathan's early years were not simply a prelude to fame. They were a masterclass in the art of human perception, social navigation, and narrative control. They were formative, shaping a man who would later mesmerize millions, command attention effortlessly, and create moments of suspense and speculation with a single sentence. But even the most skilled actor cannot fully predict the consequences of revealing hints of truth. That balance, between what is controlled and what is uncontrollable, sets the stage for everything that follows. Some moments in life feel insignificant when they happen. A handshake, a glance across a crowded room, a passing comment that seems harmless. Yet, months or years later, those seemingly trivial interactions reveal themselves to be pivotal, turning points that shape careers, relationships, and legacies. For Jonathan, one such moment occurred in the middle of a rain-soaked London evening. The city was alive with its usual chaos, double-decker buses rattling along narrow streets, black cabs weaving between puddles, and the hum of nightlife spilling out from dimly lit pubs and theaters. Jonathan had attended a small industry gathering, a casual after-party hosted by a mutual friend, ostensibly to celebrate a new play's opening. He arrived alone, slipping into the room quietly, observing with the same precision that had served him throughout his early career. The party was crowded with actors, producers, writers, and a few high-profile guests from international projects. Conversations overlapped, laughter spilled over clinking glasses, and someone played a playlist of upbeat tracks from the latest London theater musicals. It was, by all appearances, a typical networking evening, until it wasn't. Jonathan noticed her immediately. She wasn't the center of attention, not yet, but there was something magnetic in her presence. Confident, yet approachable. Engaged in conversation with a small group, laughing at something subtle, her gestures precise yet fluid. Jonathan paused for a moment, almost surprised by the intensity of the impression she made. It wasn't just her energy. It was the aura of someone accustomed to attention, but who wielded it with discretion. It's worth noting, in the theater world, introductions are often fleeting, and impressions can be easily forgotten. But Jonathan had developed an instinct for significance. He could sense when a person, a moment, or a gesture mattered. Something about this encounter, brief as it was, carried weight. Their first interaction was casual, almost incidental. She commented on the play, asking a thoughtful question about a minor scene. Jonathan responded, providing insight but maintaining a playful tone, as if engaging in conversation while simultaneously observing, measuring, and absorbing. There was a subtle chemistry in the exchange, though neither fully acknowledged it. It was professional, restrained, yet undeniably charged. What followed that night would be difficult to quantify. A shared laugh, a coincidental touch on the arm during a toast, a brief exchange of private smiles, small actions that, in isolation, would be forgotten. But Jonathan's mind cataloged each one. Each nuance, each gesture, each unspoken implication. He wasn't thinking about fame or future headlines. He was thinking about observation, human behavior, and the unexpected intensity of this connection. By the end of the evening, they had exchanged a few words in passing, then parted ways, her destination unknown to him, his destination a quiet walk through rainy streets. To any outside observer, it was insignificant, just another party interaction. But Jonathan felt a ripple, a subtle shift in perception that stayed with him long after the night ended. The following days offered reflection and speculation of a different kind. Jonathan replayed the evening repeatedly, not with regret, but with curiosity. He considered the way she moved, spoke, and engaged with others. The layers of personality he had glimpsed were unlike anything he had encountered before. Confident, intelligent, deliberate, yet approachable and human. A combination that was rare, magnetic, and, most importantly, memorable. In his pre-fame years, Jonathan had learned that such encounters could have lasting effects. A single meaningful interaction, even brief, could set a trajectory that would later appear as destiny. He knew from experience that moments like these, seemingly mundane at the time, could resurface years later in unexpected ways. This was not coincidence. Not entirely. There was a rhythm to these intersections of human behavior, a pattern that Jonathan instinctively recognized. People crossed paths, sometimes fleetingly, sometimes in ways that would later feel fated. And in this case, the impression left on both parties, though unspoken and unseen by the world, would resonate far beyond that rainy London night. What makes this encounter compelling is not just the chemistry, but the context in which it occurred. The theater world thrives on narrative, on performance, on subtle displays of power and charisma. Every smile, every gesture, every conversational maneuver carries significance. And yet, here, in this crowded, noisy room, amidst laughter and music, Jonathan recognized something rare: authenticity. This authenticity created tension. Not the kind that explodes publicly, but the quiet, almost imperceptible tension of two individuals recognizing potential significance in a fleeting encounter. It was as if the universe had orchestrated a brief alignment, a moment in which observation, timing, and intuition intersected. Over the weeks that followed, Jonathan reflected on the encounter, often revisiting it mentally while rehearsing lines, preparing for auditions, or walking alone through the city. He did not overanalyze, but he did catalog every nuance. What made it remarkable was the memory itself, clear, precise, and persistent. It demanded acknowledgement. And then came the ripple effect. In the months after that night, the world continued as usual, yet Jonathan noticed patterns that he had not anticipated. Their paths crossed again at a small charity event. This time, interaction was minimal but meaningful. A shared glance, a polite nod, subtle acknowledgement of mutual recognition. Each time they encountered one another, the moments seemed to carry more weight than the previous, building tension without explicit acknowledgement. From a narrative perspective, these small interactions created a pattern, a trajectory that could only be understood in retrospect. Observers might dismiss these moments as coincidence, but Jonathan, trained to read patterns in behavior, understood the cumulative effect. Moments once insignificant now carried implication, potential, and latent narrative. And here is the key: these encounters were never publicized. They existed entirely outside of media scrutiny, away from social media posts and tabloid headlines. They were private, fleeting, ephemeral, but they were real. And that reality, untainted by public narrative, created the tension that would later amplify his presence on live television. Because when a man like Jonathan eventually speaks in public, when he hints at a story, when he allows the slightest suggestion of personal history to surface, audiences instinctively fill in the blanks. The ambiguity, the restraint, the subtlety, all of it becomes fertile ground for speculation. And the audience, in the theater, in the media, and at home, is captivated. The curiosity loops begin. Questions arise. What exactly happened in those fleeting moments? Why were they so memorable? How did such a brief interaction leave a lasting imprint? These questions, of course, were never meant to be answered outright. The power lies in the mystery, the suggestion, the tension. Jonathan had learned this early, that the most compelling stories are those that invite participation, that compel the observer to imagine, to speculate, to invest emotionally. And so, as the night of the unexpected encounter recedes into memory, we see the architecture of suspense taking shape. The story is no longer just about the individual moments. It is about the accumulation of those moments, their hidden significance, and the tension that builds quietly, invisibly, until it erupts in the public eye. Because all of these subtle interactions, these small gestures and fleeting glances, would later contribute to the storm of attention, speculation, and fascination that followed Jonathan onto the Tonight Show stage. But what no one, not even Jonathan, could have anticipated was how public perception would transform these private, nuanced moments into global curiosity. How audiences, armed with social media and imagination, would construct narratives, theories, and hypotheses from fragments of interactions. And that is the essence of the story. The unexpected encounter is not remarkable for what was said or done, but for the way it reverberates across time. It is the seed from which narrative tension grows. It is the spark that, months or years later, ignites curiosity, speculation, and intrigue. And as the chapter closes, we return to the question, how does one moment, seemingly insignificant, hold the power to shape public fascination? How does a brief encounter between two individuals ripple across years, contexts, and audiences? Some moments remain private forever, tucked quietly into memory. Others, however, escape. They ripple outward, often unnoticed at first, until the world can't ignore them. Jonathan had experienced a few small ripples before, brief mentions in interviews, subtle fan observations, minor industry gossip. But nothing prepared him for the first public ripple that would truly transform the narrative. It began with a magazine profile. One of those long-form pieces that promised insight into the life of a rising star, blending career milestones with personal anecdotes. The writer had spent hours with Jonathan, tracing his career, observing his routines, and listening to his reflections on fame, craft, and life offstage. Most of the article was safe, the kind of glossy celebrity coverage designed to attract readers without triggering controversy. And then, almost casually, the writer included a fleeting remark about a private interaction Jonathan had decades ago, a moment in which he had crossed paths with someone who would later capture public fascination. The comment was subtle, nuanced, and completely open to interpretation. No names were given, no details revealed. But it was enough. Fans noticed, as they often do. Online forums lit up, dissecting every phrase, every implication. Reddit threads multiplied. Twitter exploded. Speculation ran rampant. People analyzed Jonathan's career, comparing dates and appearances, looking for patterns. They filled in blanks with imagination, constructing narratives from the faintest evidence. Jonathan watched it unfold quietly. He didn't tweet. He didn't comment. He didn't clarify. He let it breathe. And that, as he knew from years of experience, was the most powerful move of all. Because public curiosity is a living thing. It grows, mutates, and feeds on itself. One carefully placed hint, and the ripple becomes a wave. Jonathan understood that every subtle disclosure, every carefully ambiguous anecdote, could amplify perception far beyond what a direct statement ever could. It wasn't just about attention. It was about control. By letting the story exist in the space between fact and speculation, Jonathan directed the audience to the edges of uncertainty, compelling them to imagine, question, and participate. And participate they did. Within days, online forums were theorizing about the nature of the private interaction, who the other party might have been, and how it might have influenced Jonathan's life and career. Even seemingly innocuous comments from him in previous interviews were re-examined for hidden meaning. Headlines followed. The mysterious connection Jonathan won't explain, and fans scramble to decode Jonathan's cryptic past. Every ripple, no matter how small, fed the growing wave. The fascination intensified, spreading beyond devoted fans to the casual observer. Talk shows picked up on it, bloggers commented, and podcasts debated the potential storylines. Even people who had never seen Jonathan perform suddenly knew about a cryptic past interaction, purely because curiosity is contagious. Jonathan's management team was initially uneasy. They had spent years carefully controlling his narrative, keeping private moments private, avoiding misinterpretation. Yet here, the ripple had escaped, unstoppable. But Jonathan remained calm. He understood that true influence lies in suggestion, not revelation. He had seen how mystery could magnify perception. And then came the first direct public acknowledgement, subtle, but enough to elevate the ripple. Jonathan mentioned the interaction during a light-hearted interview, framing it as a fun memory from early career days. He smiled, glanced away, and moved on to safer topics. The casual mention was enough to give the world confirmation without ever revealing concrete details. The audience erupted with speculation. Every comment, every ambiguous anecdote, every playful gesture fed the narrative engine. Fans began connecting dots, tracing timelines, and imagining context. They dissected social appearances, cross-referenced interviews, and analyzed public events for potential overlap. Jonathan watched this quietly, an invisible conductor orchestrating waves of curiosity without touching a note. What made this ripple so effective was its ambiguity. The interaction itself remained private, nothing scandalous, nothing explicit, nothing that could be verified. And yet the world's imagination filled in the blanks. The more they speculated, the stronger the ripple became. People debated what really happened, why it mattered, and what it implied about Jonathan's private and professional life. In essence, the ripple was a lesson in human fascination. People are drawn to stories that are incomplete, mysterious, or tantalizingly ambiguous. Jonathan had accidentally, or perhaps deliberately, created the perfect storm. This was also the moment when perception began to diverge from reality. Fans constructed elaborate narratives, some flattering, some mischievous, some absurd. Social media became a living archive of speculation, a public map of curiosity that Jonathan could observe from afar. He remained deliberately aloof, letting the curiosity feed itself, knowing that attention guided by ambiguity can often achieve more than attention drawn by revelation. And the ripple wasn't contained to the digital realm. Industry insiders began to notice. Colleagues, producers, and other celebrities commented obliquely in interviews, hinting at awareness without confirmation. Private conversations in quiet corners at industry events carried the faint tension of knowledge, half acknowledged, unspoken, but potent. By the end of the first ripple phase, Jonathan had unwittingly, or perhaps knowingly, transformed a private memory into a public phenomenon. A single, subtle anecdote, once forgotten in the hum of a quiet party or the backstage corridors of early career theater, now occupied the imaginations of thousands. And yet, this was only the beginning. Every ripple creates a wave, and every wave eventually collides with something else. For Jonathan, the collision would come during a live televised appearance, a moment designed for entertainment but primed for suspense. Because the first ripple set expectations. It primed the audience for ambiguity, curiosity, and speculation. By the time Jonathan stepped onto the Tonight Show stage, millions were already anticipating nuance, hints, and suggestion. The ripple had traveled from quiet memory to the digital sphere, and now it was ready to become a public wave. But the wave is unpredictable. No matter how skilled you are at managing perception, at controlling narrative, or at influencing curiosity, once a story enters the public sphere, it develops a life of its own. Fans imagine, speculate, and debate. The media interprets, misinterprets, and amplifies. Social networks transform nuance into headlines, detail into conjecture. Jonathan understood this, which is why he approached the first public ripple with calm precision. But even with careful observation and measured responses, he could not control the full trajectory of what he had set in motion. The wave of curiosity would grow, unpredictably, until it reached the point where private reflection collided with public spectacle. And that collision, the next major public moment, would elevate the narrative from quiet intrigue to global fascination. But what happens when a ripple turns into a wave? When subtlety meets mass attention? How does a man who thrives in nuance navigate the chaos that follows? In the world of celebrity, anticipation is as powerful as revelation. The public doesn't just respond to events, it responds to expectation. And for Jonathan, the stage was set not by accident, but by a careful orchestration of subtle signals, private interactions, and the first ripple of public curiosity. The days leading up to the televised appearance were unlike any he had experienced. Every social media post, every media snippet, and every fan discussion seemed to pulse with speculation. Comments ranged from playful curiosity to obsessive analysis, as if audiences were all simultaneously trying to decode a puzzle that existed in fragments. Jonathan observed quietly. He had learned that control was illusionary. The only thing an actor, or anyone in the public eye, can influence is perception, and perception thrives on timing. Every glance, every smile, every carefully worded phrase contributes to a narrative, and anticipation is the engine that drives engagement. In preparation for the upcoming show, Jonathan revisited his previous encounters. The moments that had once seemed private, the fleeting connections, the small gestures, the glances exchanged, were now imbued with new significance. They were no longer just memories. They were building blocks in a story the world was already eager to interpret. Even the media sensed it. Entertainment reporters and talk show hosts began speculating openly. What will Jonathan reveal? Is there a hidden story behind his career? Will he finally comment on the mysterious interaction fans have been dissecting? Every headline, every tweet, every podcast discussion added tension. It was a living, breathing build-up, an ecosystem of expectation. Jonathan's team, normally meticulous, approached these days with a mixture of anxiety and awe. How much should be said in advance? How much should remain deliberately ambiguous? Every decision carried weight. A misstep in framing, a casual comment misinterpreted, could ignite a firestorm. And yet, Jonathan remained composed, confident in his understanding of human curiosity and narrative tension. The nights before the show were spent in reflection. Jonathan revisited past interviews, rehearsed potential questions, and imagined the audience's reactions to different approaches. Not every memory would be shared, not every nuance would be revealed, but he considered carefully how each hint, each suggestion, each pause could amplify the curiosity loop. He also considered timing on a personal level. Fame is an arena of immediacy, where perception changes moment by moment. But Jonathan had learned patience early in his career. A carefully timed revelation has far greater impact than one delivered impulsively. He knew the audience would notice subtle cues, the way he smiled, the way he glanced at the host, the cadence of his voice, and he could use these to his advantage. Meanwhile, fans and media alike continued to speculate. Every appearance Jonathan made in the days prior, from talk show promos to magazine shoots, was analyzed under a microscope. Every small gesture became fodder for discussion. Was that a knowing smile? A subtle nod to the past? A hint at the interactions that had become public curiosity? The anticipation reached a fever pitch. And yet, Jonathan remained calm. This was the essence of his craft, the ability to inhabit both presence and control. He understood the power of suggestion and the potency of ambiguity. By allowing curiosity to thrive without full disclosure, he maintained a narrative in which the audience actively participated. The story, once private, had become communal. People imagined it, debated it, and speculated on it in ways no statement could ever replicate. On the morning of the appearance, Jonathan prepared meticulously. Wardrobe, demeanor, and delivery were all considered. The slightest misalignment in tone could dilute the tension. He knew the audience would be watching not only his words, but his body language, the way he carried himself, the energy he projected. Everything mattered, even the pauses between sentences. By the time the cameras rolled, Jonathan was fully aware of the stakes. He had built attention over months through subtle memory hints, public ripples, and careful suggestion. Now, he stood on the precipice, ready to convert anticipation into spectacle. The audience, both in the studio and watching from home, was primed. They didn't know what to expect, which is exactly what Jonathan wanted. The host greeted him warmly, but there was an undercurrent of tension. Hosts know the rhythm of television, but they also recognize when a guest brings an energy beyond standard banter. Jonathan's presence was magnetic, calm, measured, yet charged with subtle unpredictability. Every gesture, every word, every glance contributed to the building momentum. And then came the first hint. A playful, cryptic comment about the past. Not explicit, not scandalous, but suggestive enough to ignite curiosity immediately. The audience leaned in. Laughter rippled nervously, applause followed, and social media erupted. Within minutes, viewers began speculating in real time. The anticipation Jonathan had cultivated for months now found its outlet in the collective imagination of millions. Behind the scenes, producers noted the shift. They saw what Jonathan already knew. Suspense, even minor, captivates. Ambiguity, carefully deployed, becomes magnetic. Audiences are drawn not to revelation, but to the promise of revelation. And Jonathan had mastered the art of promise. Every subtle reference, every nuanced expression reinforced the narrative. The curiosity loops intensified. Viewers began connecting dots, imagining scenarios, and debating implications. They didn't need concrete facts. They craved the tension itself. The anticipation, the speculation, the interplay between public curiosity and private experience. All of it was the story. By the end of the segment, Jonathan had achieved what few in his position could. He had turned expectation into engagement, curiosity into obsession, and ambiguity into influence. The build-up to the spotlight had reached its peak. The ripple had transformed into a wave, and the public was caught in its pull. And yet, even at this moment of apparent control, the next wave was unpredictable. Once curiosity has been unleashed, it can never be fully contained. Social media amplified nuances into headlines. Forums theorized endlessly, and the global audience imagined far more than any single interaction could convey. Jonathan, the master of timing and perception, recognized this truth. The public had become co-authors of the story, creating a narrative that extended far beyond his own intentions. The anticipation he had cultivated was no longer just his to manage, it belonged to everyone watching. And that sets the stage for what comes next, the moment when private memory, public speculation, and carefully cultivated curiosity converge on live television. The spotlight is no longer just a metaphor. It is a crucible where narrative, perception, and anticipation collide. Because every wave eventually crashes. Every ripple eventually reaches its peak. And every carefully built expectation demands a payoff, whether the audience is ready or not. But what happens when anticipation meets reality? When months of suggestion and private reflection collide with the immediacy of public attention? It's one thing to build anticipation, to cultivate curiosity, to let subtle ripples grow into waves. It's another entirely to step into the glare of the spotlight, where every word, every glance, every breath is amplified 1,000-fold. For Jonathan, this moment was both a culmination and a test, the point where private memory, public speculation, and deliberate performance intersected. The Tonight Show stage is a unique arena. Unlike theater, where the audience's reaction is immediate and contained, television brings millions of unseen eyes into the equation. Every gesture, every pause, every micro-expression is dissected instantly, some analytically, some emotionally, and some maliciously. The margin for error is almost non-existent. And yet, for someone trained to inhabit duality, to remain controlled while projecting authenticity, it is also a stage of immense opportunity. The audience cheered as Jonathan entered, applause cascading like waves across the studio floor. The camera captured him in full frame, confident, composed, magnetic. His smile was measured, inviting, yet hinting at a depth the audience could feel but not fully grasp. The applause continued as he sat across from the host, the lights bright, the cameras rolling, and the energy palpable. The first few minutes of the segment were standard, casual banter, playful jokes, stories from recent projects. Jonathan navigated it expertly, demonstrating his wit, charm, and ease under pressure. Yet beneath the surface, a subtle tension built. The audience sensed something unsaid, something hinted at, something just out of reach. It was the curiosity loop he had cultivated for months, now entering its apex. And then came the pivot, the moment designed to tease, to hint, to ignite speculation without confirming anything directly. The host asked a seemingly innocuous question about memorable experiences, phrased to elicit anecdotes from his career. Jonathan smiled, paused, and leaned in slightly. His tone was conversational, casual, yet charged with the tension of implication. He began to speak, choosing words that balance charm and ambiguity. A story, a reference, a fleeting memory. Not explicit, not revealing, but suggestive enough to make the audience lean forward in anticipation. There was laughter, murmurs, and an almost imperceptible shift in the studio energy. The subtle electricity of curiosity transformed into collective attention. Social media, already primed by weeks of speculation, erupted instantly. Clips circulated within minutes, hashtags trended, and fans began dissecting every word, every gesture, every glance. Jonathan's subtlety became the spark that set a wildfire of analysis and debate into motion. Every microexpression, every inflection, every pause was scrutinized, replayed, and theorized about. Behind the scenes, production staff watched with a mix of awe and tension. They knew the power of what was unfolding. A private recollection transformed into global intrigue through careful timing and narrative control. Jonathan's ability to navigate the moment was exceptional. He delivered enough to tantalize, yet withheld enough to preserve mystery. It was this careful calibration that made the spotlight moment so electric. The audience wasn't just listening. They were participating. Each viewer became a co-author of the story, filling in the blanks, projecting scenarios, and speculating on possibilities. Jonathan's control of narrative extended beyond words. It lived in the imagination of millions. Yet, even amid control, unpredictability is inevitable. Social media interpretation, fan conjecture, and media amplification are forces beyond any individual's command. The subtleties that Jonathan delivered was instantly magnified, recontextualized, and debated across platforms. What had been private, nuanced, and ephemeral became public, enduring, and viral. This tension, between intention and perception, control and chaos, defines the spotlight moment. It is a crucible where personal mastery is tested against public appetite for revelation. And in that crucible, Jonathan thrived, demonstrating both poise and the intuitive understanding of narrative suspense. Every anecdote, every gesture, every pause was a calculated measure. The audience could sense it, consciously or not. The allure wasn't in scandal, nor in outright confession. It was in implication, suggestion, and the delicate tension between what was said and what remained unsaid. That tension is magnetic. It draws attention, fuels speculation, and sustains engagement long after the cameras stop rolling. As the segment progressed, Jonathan's delivery remained precise, yet playful. He allowed moments of laughter, subtle glances, and understated emphasis to punctuate the story. Each beat contributed to the suspense without breaking the careful balance. The public, primed by prior ripples and anticipation, responded immediately. Online conversation spiked. Analysts dissected the interaction. Fans debated the hidden meaning. Every moment Jonathan had cultivated in private and public subtly converged here, on the live stage, creating a crescendo of curiosity. And then, just as the segment approached its peak, Jonathan introduced a final element of tension, a single line, delivered casually, that hinted at past intimacy without specifying context, parties, or outcomes. The audience gasped softly, laughter rippled nervously, and the studio energy shifted. It was a moment of perfect narrative ambiguity, tantalizing, suggestive, yet unconfirmable. That single line, fleeting as it was, triggered a cascade. Social media exploded. Headlines proliferated. Clips went viral. Fans debated what it meant. Journalists speculated on implications, and the public was left suspended in the tension of unanswered questions. Jonathan had achieved what few could. He had converted private memory into public curiosity, controlled the narrative while letting it spread uncontrollably, and created a moment that would live long after the cameras stopped rolling. Even those close to him recognized the mastery. Friends, colleagues, and industry insiders watched with awe. He had taken years of experience, years of observation, timing, and self-discipline, and applied it flawlessly. The spotlight moment wasn't a slip, nor an accident. It was a deliberate, measured performance that leveraged the entire arc of public anticipation, pre-fame experience, and private reflection. Yet, as with all waves, the aftermath was unpredictable. Once curiosity is ignited, it cannot be contained. The ripple expands into discussion, speculation, and debate, and soon, the story takes on a life of its own. Jonathan understood this implicitly, which is why he remained poised, calm, and controlled, even as millions responded, speculated, and theorized in real time. And as the cameras cut away, the live audience clapped, and the segment ended, one thing became clear. The spotlight moment was more than entertainment. It was a study in perception, narrative control, and the human fascination with ambiguity. It was a carefully orchestrated collision of private experience and public imagination, executed with precision, yet leaving the world craving more. But even mastery cannot predict every consequence. Every ripple has aftereffects. Every tease has interpretations. And every public moment, however calculated, creates curiosity that spreads faster and further than the orchestrator can manage. Which leads us to the next chapter, a chapter that explores the aftermath, the reactions, and the consequences of the spotlight moment. How the public, the media, and the global audience process Jonathan's subtle revelations. How speculation transformed into obsession. And how a single, carefully delivered moment can dominate conversation, imagination, and perception for weeks, if not months. The moment the cameras cut, the world reacted. The applause of the studio audience had barely faded before social media ignited. Fans, journalists, and casual viewers alike dissected every syllable, every glance, and every subtle gesture Jonathan had made on the Tonight Show stage. What had been a private memory, carefully hinted at, was now a public puzzle, a global curiosity loop in motion. Twitter exploded first. Clips of Jonathan's playful, ambiguous comment went viral within minutes. Hashtags multiplied. Hashtag Jonathan Reveal. Hashtag Spotlight Moment. Hashtag What Did He Mean? Each tweet generated thousands of reactions, retweets, and threads. Memes emerged, some humorous, some analytical, each interpreting his words in a different way. The ambiguity of the moment fed speculation, and speculation thrived on imagination. Reddit forums and discussion boards became hives of activity. Fans cross-referenced timelines, interviews, and social appearances. Every public event, every media clip, every social gesture was examined for context. Was there a hidden meaning behind a glance in an old interview? Could a fleeting moment in a photo have been a clue? The subtle tension Jonathan had cultivated months prior now exploded into full-blown analysis. Entertainment journalists joined the frenzy. Columnists wrote op-eds debating the implications of the comment, breaking down tone, timing, and delivery with painstaking precision. Late-night hosts joked about it, using playful speculation to entertain their own audiences. Podcast hosts spent entire episodes theorizing, interpreting, and even dramatizing the moment. The ripple Jonathan had cultivated had become a tsunami, and the world was caught in its pull. Meanwhile, Jonathan remained composed. He did not tweet. He did not give clarifying interviews. He allowed the speculation to grow, knowing that the tension, the ambiguity, was the story. In his mind, this was the apex of narrative control, the public creating intrigue for him, without any need for direct disclosure. But the scale of the reaction surprised even him. News outlets across the globe reported on the subtleties. Headlines varied from playful curiosity to sensationalized conjecture. Jonathan hints at private past on live TV, or mystery moment sparks global speculation. Social media translated this frenzy into millions of impressions, and suddenly, a private anecdote had transcended boundaries, cultures, and time zones. The phenomenon wasn't just about fans. Academics in media studies began analyzing the moment as a case study in public perception, ambiguity, and narrative management. Journalists cited it as an example of how suggestion can be more powerful than revelation. Online discussions spilled into mainstream media, creating a feedback loop. Speculation fueled reporting, and reporting fueled further speculation. And yet, for all the chaos, Jonathan's intent remained intact. He had never aimed to dominate headlines. He had sought engagement, curiosity, and narrative tension, the interplay between what is known and what is imagined. In that sense, the global reaction was a masterclass in perception management. Every retweet, every article, every discussion was a manifestation of the curiosity loops he had set in motion. Fans began to engage in an extraordinary exercise of collective imagination. Some dissected his wardrobe choices, claiming subtle cues were intentional nods to his past experiences. Others analyzed his body language, the microexpressions, and even the timing of pauses. Entire theories emerged, some plausible, some wildly speculative, each building on the ambiguity Jonathan had left intact. Meanwhile, the media landscape reacted predictably but powerfully. Headlines sought clicks, audiences sought drama, and the curiosity loop fed itself. Viral clips circulated globally, news anchors replayed the tease, and opinion pieces debated the significance. Every platform amplified the moment, reinforcing the narrative and magnifying anticipation for the next potential reveal. It was not limited to English-language media. International outlets translated clips, subtitled analyses, and highlighted commentary from American audiences. The ripple effect crossed continents, reaching viewers who had never previously engaged with Jonathan's work. He had become, for a brief moment, a global figure not just of talent, but of intrigue. Even the general public became invested. Casual viewers, drawn in by clips on social media, began forming their own hypotheses. The ambiguity was irresistible. The tease was enough to spark curiosity, debate, and even obsession. People who knew nothing about his career were suddenly speculating about his private past. The ripple had reached beyond the fan base and into mainstream cultural consciousness. Behind the scenes, industry colleagues watched in amazement. Jonathan's approach, subtle, controlled, yet profoundly influential, became a topic of private conversation in Hollywood and London alike. Actors, producers, and publicists dissected the performance, not to imitate it, but to understand the subtle mastery of timing, perception, and narrative ambiguity. And yet, amid the frenzy, Jonathan remained observant. He watched the patterns, the feedback loops, the ways in which audiences interpreted suggestion. He understood that attention is not a finite resource. It grows through curiosity, speculation, and ambiguity. And he recognized that while he could guide perception, he could never fully predict it. The global reaction was beyond control, yet entirely within the ecosystem of influence he had nurtured. As the days unfolded, the moment continued to dominate conversation. Clips reappeared in late-night shows, commentary segments, and even morning news programs. Fan theories became elaborate, some turning into detailed timelines, charts, and hypothetical scenarios. The subtleties Jonathan had offered became a narrative unto itself, a story of ambiguity, curiosity, and suspense that existed independently of any factual revelation. And within that narrative, Jonathan's mastery was evident. He had transformed a private memory into a public phenomenon without losing control. The world speculated, debated, and imagined, yet he remained poised, elusive, and magnetic. The ripple had become a global wave, powerful, uncontainable, and endlessly engaging. But waves have momentum, and momentum carries consequences. The global reaction did not just elevate curiosity, it created expectation. Fans, media, and observers now anticipated more detail, more revelation, more nuance. And anticipation, as he knew, is a double-edged sword. It heightens engagement, but also magnifies pressure, scrutiny, and the stakes of every subsequent move. This is where the story deepens. The global reaction transformed the moment into a narrative that demanded continuation. What had started as a subtle tease now carried a weight of expectation, curiosity, and potential controversy. Jonathan's every next appearance would be analyzed against this backdrop. Every gesture